In this video, you're going to be installing and setting up your very first Redux store. By the end, you will have a store in place. Now, we're going to explore Redux in isolation. So we're not going to worry about connecting it to our React components yet. We're just going to create a new file in the playground folder. We're going to mess around with the fundamentals of the Redux library. Then, once we understand the fundamentals, we can add just a little bit of code to connect it to React. So I want to kick things off by creating a new file in the playground folder. I'm going to call this one redux101.js. And inside of here, we're going to go through that very basic Redux example, and then we'll explore more complex techniques, and finally, we'll connect it all to React. So to kick things off, we're going to have Webpack run this file instead of app.js. That's going to cause our router and our components to not render, but that's okay. We're just going to focus on using the console output to check our work. So over inside of the Webpack config file, I'm going to change the entry point from source app.js to source/playground/ the file we just created, redux-101.js. Now if I save the Webpack config file, we should be able to toss a console.log up here, 101. And if I rerun the dev server, we should see that over inside of the browser. I'm going to switch over to the terminal, shut down the developer server, start it up once again, and switch to the browser. Right here, we can see that if we do refresh the page, we have nothing showing up in the viewport, and down below in the console, we are indeed getting 101, which means that we are ready to actually install and use Redux right inside of here. Now, as always, I do want to make you aware of where you can learn more. Redux has a fantastic site that walks through just an incredible amount of use cases. We're going to head over there. That is redux.js.org. Now, almost all of the stuff that is here, we will be covering throughout the course. We're going to talk about the basics. We already talked about some of the motivation-related issues in the last video, and we're going to get on to more advanced things later on in the course, talking about how we can use Redux in an asynchronous context. So for now, though, what we're going to do is just install this tool and work through some of the most basic examples, learning about the building blocks we need to put together to create a Redux store that we can read from and manipulate. So step one, installing the new tool. I'm going to do that by switching over to the terminal, shut down the dev server, and use yarn add. We are adding Redux, and we're going to be adding it with the current version, that is 3.7.2. All right, we can go ahead and get this one installed, and once it is installed, we're actually going to be able to take advantage of it in our Redux 101 file. I'm going to restart the dev server for the final time in this video, and once it's up, we'll actually be able to use Redux. So over here, we're going to kick things off by importing some stuff off of the library that we just installed. Right here, we're going to be importing a single named export. It's a function called create store, and we're going to be grabbing that off of the library we just installed, Redux. So create store is something that we're going to call once to create the store. Once we have the store in place, we're not going to need to call it again, but we do have to import it in order to kick things off. So right here, we can go ahead and delete the console.log line, and we can make a store. I'm going to create a const. I'm going to call that const store, and we're going to set it equal to a call to create store. Now, you can't actually call create store without any arguments. It does expect a function to be the first argument, so we're going to go ahead and provide that right here. I'm going to set up a single function as the first and only argument to the create store function. Now, the first argument to this function is going to be state. So this is going to be the current state, and that's very similar to how our calls to this.setState worked. We set them up with an arrow function, and we accessed the previous state, and we returned the new state. So if I didn't want to make any changes, I could just return prev state, and that would successfully do absolutely nothing, but it's perfectly valid. So the first argument to the function that we pass to create store is the current state. Now, we don't have a constructor function where we can set up the default. So we actually set up the default right here. I'm going to set state equal to the default state object. So if there is no current state, what do we want to start off at? Well, we're going to have an object with a single property count, and we're going to start count off at 0. So I'm going to stick with that counter example where we can increment, decrement, and reset the count. It's going to be a great way to explore the basics of Redux. Then we'll move on to more real world and more complex application states. For now, though, we have a great function in place. We have the state set up, we have a default value, and we can go ahead and just return the state, successfully making 0 changes to the application state. But at this point, we do have a completely valid call to create store. So let's go ahead and explore a method we have on store down below. This is store.getState. GetState returns the current state object. So all we're going to do is wrap this in parentheses and toss a console.log up front. If we go ahead and save Redux 101 over in the browser, we are going to get an object back with a count of 0. This might not seem like a big deal, but we successfully created our very first Redux state container. We set up a default state value, and we were able to actually get that value back using store.getState. And now this is actually where I'd like to stop for the video. So let's take a quick moment to talk about what we've learned so far. First up, we learned that to use Redux, we have to access create store. We call this function to actually create a store. And the store is that thing that tracks our changing data over time. Now, what we know about create store is that we have to pass a function in, and that function gets called once right away. That's why we're seeing a count of 0 right here. So when we call create store and we pass the function in, the function gets called. There is no state the first time Redux calls this function, so the default state value is used. We then return that. That becomes the new state, and that's why we're seeing count set to 0 over here. If I were to tweak the count value from 0 to 10, we would see 10 printing in the console, and that's showing up right there. Now, obviously, we are going to start off at 0, but it's important to know that whatever you set state equal to right here, that is the default state object. We also learned that we can fetch the current state, get that object back, using the getState method on the store. This returns the actual object, and we can use those values to do anything we might need to do, whether it's render a component or make a call to some sort of changing data source. Now at this point, we know some stuff, but there are plenty of things we do not know how to do. For example, how do I say something like I'd like to increment the count? How do I increase the state value count by 1? Or something like I'd like to reset the count to 0. We currently have no way to actually get that done. So in the next video, we're going to talk about how we can change the data inside of our Redux store. This is what actually makes it useful. And we're going to do that using a tool called actions. So the next video is all about actions. You're going to learn exactly what they are and how they work, and that'll allow us to create a changing data store. I'm very excited to get to that, so stay tuned. I'll see you in the next one.